The complete history of cars, from steam engines to self-driving vehicles. This is the story of how the automobile transformed from a steam-powered curiosity in 1769 to the electric, self-driving vehicles reshaping our world today. Over 136 years of continuous innovation, the car has evolved through multiple technological revolutions, reshaped entire societies, and fundamentally changed how humans live, work, and connect with each other. We're walking through this entire journey chronologically, starting with the earliest experiments in self-propelled vehicles, through the birth of the gasoline automobile, the mass production revolution, the safety innovations that saved millions of lives, and finally to today's electric and autonomous vehicle revolution. This isn't just a story about machines, it's about the inventors who defied skeptics, the companies that rose and fell, and the profound impact these vehicles had on every aspect of modern life. Before Carl Benz received his famous automobile patent in 1886, inventors around the world were already experimenting with self-propelled vehicles, and the story actually begins more than a century earlier in the heart of Paris, October 23, 1769. A French military engineer named Nicolas-Joseph Cugnot demonstrated something the world had never seen before, a vehicle that moved entirely on its own power. His creation, called the Fardier à vapeur, essentially a steam-powered artillery tractor, weighed 2.5 tons and lumbered through Paris at about 4 kilometers per hour. But it had one major problem. Every 15 minutes, the thing needed to stop and rebuild steam pressure. King Louis XV was impressed enough to grant Cugnot a pension of 600 livres in 1772, and the original vehicle is still preserved today at the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris. Steam wasn't the only technology being explored. Here's something that surprises most people. Electric vehicles actually predate gasoline cars. Between 1832 and 1839, a Scottish inventor named Robert Anderson developed a crude electric carriage that wasn't practical yet because battery technology was in its infancy, but the concept was there. The real breakthrough for electric vehicles came in 1859 when Gaston Planté invented the lead-acid battery, which made practical electric vehicles possible and set the stage for what would become a surprisingly competitive three-way race between steam, electric, and gasoline power. Meanwhile, inventors were making progress on internal combustion engines. The Niecks brothers patented something called the pyreolophore in 1807, the first internal combustion engine patent ever issued, and then in 1860, Etienne Lenoir created the first commercial internal combustion engine. Running on coal gas, about 280 of them were built by 1867. But the engine that would change everything came from a German engineer named Nikolaus Otto. Otto patented his four-stroke engine in 1876, and what he created became known as the Otto cycle, which remains the fundamental design of modern gasoline engines to this very day. His Otto silent engine produced 3 horsepower with 11% efficiency, which was revolutionary for the time, and the market validated his invention immediately, with over 30,000 units sold in the next decade. By the mid-1880s, all the pieces were finally in place. The 4-stroke internal combustion engine existed, battery technology had advanced enough for electric vehicles, and steam power was well understood. The stage was set for someone to put it all together into what we would recognize as the first real automobile. The years 1885 and 1886 represent one of the most concentrated periods of automotive innovation in history, with 2 separate German engineering teams working independently and apparently unaware of each other's work, both creating vehicles that would forever change transportation. November 1885, Gottlieb Daimler and his engineering partner Wilhelm Maybach, who was known as the king of the constructors, built and tested something called the Reitwagen, which means riding car, and this was essentially the world's first motorcycle. The test ride was memorable for an unfortunate reason. Daimler's 17-year-old son Paul piloted it, and during the ride the seat actually caught fire. The engine worked though. Then on January 29, 1886, something historic happened. Carl Benz, a German engineer, received patent number DRP 37435 for what he called a vehicle powered by a gas engine, and this patent is now recognized as the automobile's birth certificate. Benz had built a 3-wheeled vehicle called the Patent Motor Wagon that featured a 954 cubic centimeter single-cylinder engine producing 0.68 PS, that's less than 1 horsepower at 250 revolutions per minute, with a top speed of about 16 kilometers per hour. The original price was 600 Imperial German marks, which translates to about $4,524 in 2021 currency, and about 25 units were built between 1886 and 1893. Benz first publicly drove his patent motor wagon on July 3, 1886, marking the first public automobile demonstration in history, but Daimler and Maybach weren't far behind. On March 8, 1886, just months after Benz's patent, they completed their first four-wheeled automobile by fitting their engine to a horse carriage. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Benz's wife, Bertha, recognized that her husband's invention needed more than technical validation. It needed to prove it could actually be useful for real travel. So on August 5, 1888, without telling her husband, Bertha Benz took the patent motor wagon on the first long-distance automobile journey in history. She drove from Mannheim to Pforzheim and back, somewhere between 180 and 194 kilometers round trip, and during this journey she encountered problems and solved them on the spot. When the wooden brakes wore out, she actually invented brake lining right there on the road, and she stopped at a pharmacy to buy Ligrone, a petroleum solvent to use as fuel, making that pharmacy the world's first gas station. While all this was happening in Germany, electric vehicles were gaining serious traction elsewhere. William Morrison built the first successful American electric vehicle in 1890, a six-passenger vehicle with a 14-mile-per-hour top speed, and when it was displayed at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, it caused a sensation. By 1897, electric taxis were operating in New York City, and by 1900, there were 60 electric taxis in New York, featuring something remarkably modern, a battery-swapping station. Here's a statistic that might shock you. Around the year 1900, if you looked at the American automobile market, steam vehicles had a 40% share, electric vehicles had a 38% share, and gasoline vehicles had just 22%. Electric and steam together dominated the market. Benz took another major step forward in 1894 with the Benz Velo, the first series-produced automobile in history, with about 1,200 units built. This was mass production in its earliest form, and it proved that automobiles could be more than one-off experiments. The period ended with a dramatic demonstration of electric vehicle capability. Camille Janazzi, a Belgian driver, broke the 100-kilometer-per-hour barrier in 1899 in an electric car called La Jamais Contente, which means the never satisfied, and this was the first vehicle ever to exceed 60 miles per hour. Electric vehicles weren't just viable, they were setting speed records. So as we entered the 20th century, the automobile existed in three forms: steam, electric, and gasoline, and each had advantages. Steam engines were powerful but required warm-up time. Electric vehicles were quiet and clean but limited in range, and gasoline engines were loud and dirty but offered the best combination of range and refueling speed. The market hadn't yet decided which technology would win. The early 1900s saw automobiles transition from expensive toys for the wealthy to products that could potentially reach the average person. And this transformation required two key innovations: mass production techniques and the vision to see automobiles as transportation for everyone, not just the elite. The first American to really crack mass production was actually not Henry Ford. It was a man named Ransom E. Olds, who in 1901 mass-produced the Curved Dash Oldsmobile, the first mass-produced American car. Olds pioneered the assembly line concept that Ford would later perfect and popularize. But Henry Ford would take mass production to an entirely different level, and in doing so change not just the automobile industry but manufacturing itself. Ford Motor Company was incorporated in Detroit on June 16, 1903, and Ford had a clear vision that he stated plainly: "I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family but small enough for the individual to run and care for, but it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one." That vision became reality on October 1, 1908, when production began on the Model T with an initial price of $850, expensive but far cheaper than most automobiles of the era. The Model T was simple, durable, and designed to handle the rough roads that existed in rural America, exactly what Ford promised: a car for the great multitude. But Ford wasn't satisfied with just building a good car. He wanted to build it faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. On October 7, 1913, Ford opened the Highland Park plant, the first automobile production facility with a moving assembly line, and then on December 1, 1913, Ford installed the moving chassis assembly line. And this is where the revolution really happened. The numbers are staggering. Before the moving assembly line, it took 728 minutes, over 12 hours to assemble a Model T chassis. But after implementing the moving assembly line with a mechanized belt moving at 6 feet per minute, that time dropped to 93 minutes, which represents an 87% reduction in assembly time. The car that took half a day to build now took an hour and a half. The impact on production was immediate and dramatic. Ford built 170,211 Model Ts in 1913, and by 1923, annual production peaked at 2,011,125 vehicles, and as production scaled up, prices came down. That $850 Model T from 1908 cost just $260 by 1925. But Ford understood something that many industrialists of his era didn't. His workers needed to be able to afford the products they were making. On January 5, 1914, Ford made an announcement that shocked the business world. He was implementing a $5 workday, essentially doubling the wages of his workers, and business leaders called him crazy, even socialist. Ford understood the economics, though. High turnover was expensive, and before the wage increase, Ford's annual employee turnover rate was 380%, meaning he had to hire and train nearly 4 workers for every position every year. But after the $5 workday, turnover dropped to just 1.4%. The stable, well-paid workforce became more efficient, and workers could now afford to buy the cars they built. The Model T became more than just a car, it became a cultural phenomenon. Owners could repair it themselves because it was simple enough, it was tough enough to handle terrible roads, and it was cheap enough that farmers, small business owners, and middle-class families could afford it. Ford famously said customers could have it in any color they wanted, as long as it was black, though actually, early Model Ts came in several colors, and Ford only standardized on black later because black paint dried fastest, speeding up production. On May 26, 1927, the 15 millionth Model T rolled off the assembly line, bringing total production to about 14.7 million vehicles. No single automobile model had ever achieved anything close to that scale before, and the Model T had accomplished exactly what Ford set out to do. It had put the world on wheels. Ford's innovation went far beyond the automobile industry. His assembly line techniques were studied and copied by manufacturers around the world, and the Ford production system became the foundation for modern manufacturing. Efficiency experts analyzed every motion, every tool placement, every step in the process, and the moving assembly line didn't just change how cars were built, it changed how everything was built. Other manufacturers had to respond. General Motors incorporated on September 16, 1908, the same year the Model T launched, took a different approach, and instead of making one simple, affordable car like Ford, GM offered multiple brands at different price points. Chevrolet for entry-level buyers, Pontiac and Oldsmobile for the middle class, Buick for the well-off, and Cadillac for the wealthy. GM also pioneered the concept of annual model changes, making car ownership about more than just transportation. It became about status and staying current with the latest features, and by 1931, GM had overtaken Ford as the market leader. The assembly line era did more than make cars affordable. It created the modern American middle class. Factory workers making $5 a day could save up and buy a car, and that car gave them mobility to live farther from work, to take their families on road trips, to explore beyond their immediate neighborhoods. The automobile and the assembly line together created a new social and economic order. As American manufacturers perfected mass production, automobile manufacturing spread globally, with different regions developing their own distinctive approaches and innovations. In Europe, the manufacturers that had created the automobile were evolving. Benz and SIA and Daimler Motorengesellschaft, the companies founded by Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler, merged in 1926 to form Mercedes-Benz, and the Mercedes name itself had been registered back on September 23, 1902, named after the daughter of Emil Jelinek, an automotive entrepreneur. Mercedes-Benz would become synonymous with engineering excellence and innovation, pioneering technologies like diesel passenger cars, crumple zones, and electronic safety systems. In Sweden, on August 10, 1926, two entrepreneurs named Assar Gabrielsson and Gustaf Larsson founded Volvo in Gothenburg, and Volvo would eventually become famous for something that went far beyond performance or luxury. They became the safety company, but we'll get to their revolutionary safety innovations a bit later. Germany saw another major development in 1937 with the founding of Volkswagen. Ferdinand Porsche, who had earlier created one of the first electric vehicles and the world's first gasoline-electric hybrid around 1900, designed the original Volkswagen Beetle, which would go on to become an icon with over 21 million units produced, making it a symbol of affordable, reliable transportation across the globe. Meanwhile, in Japan, something significant was happening. Kiichiro Toyota, son of loom inventor Sakichi Toyota, founded Toyota on August 28, 1937, and starting from a textile machinery background, Toyota would eventually develop the Toyota production system, which revolutionized manufacturing efficiency worldwide. This system emphasized eliminating waste, continuous improvement, and just-in-time production. And today, Toyota is the world's largest automaker with about 10.39 million vehicles sold in 2024. Another Japanese company, Honda, was founded on September 24, 1948, by Soichiro Honda and Takeo Fujisawa, and Honda started with motorcycles and didn't produce its first car, the S500, until 1963. Honda would become known for engineering innovations like V-Tech engines and would eventually expand into robotics and even aircraft manufacturing. American manufacturers were also evolving, and by the late 1930s and 1940s, the Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, dominated American production. They built vehicles that reflected American tastes: large, powerful, comfortable, and increasingly focused on styling and features. GM introduced something in 1939 that would change driving forever: the Hydra-Matic, the first mass-produced automatic transmission. Before this, every driver needed to manually shift gears, operating a clutch pedal and gear lever, and the automatic transmission made driving more accessible to everyone, and became especially popular in the United States, where long-distance highway driving made the convenience particularly appealing. During this era, automobiles went from being utilitarian transportation devices to becoming cultural symbols and status objects, and manufacturers competed not just on reliability and price, but on styling, power, and features. The 1950s and 1960s saw the rise of muscle cars, luxury vehicles, and automotive designs that emphasized chrome, fins, and raw horsepower. But there was a growing problem that nobody wanted to talk about: safety. By the 1950s and 1960s, automobiles had become faster, heavier, and far more dangerous, and traffic fatalities were rising. But automobile manufacturers largely treated safety as a marketing problem. They believed that emphasizing safety would scare customers away from buying cars. Manufacturers focused on styling, speed, and comfort, while safety innovations were often dismissed as unnecessary or too expensive. That attitude was about to change, thanks to innovations from engineers who understood that safety should be shared and advocates who refused to accept preventable deaths. Two revolutionary safety innovations emerged in 1959, and the first came from Bella Barini at Mercedes-Benz, who had actually patented the crumple zone concept in 1952 with patent number 854,157. Barini's design featured a three-cell vehicle structure, a rigid passenger compartment flanked by front and rear zones specifically designed to crumple and absorb crash energy. And the idea was counterintuitive, deliberately making parts of the car weak so that the passenger compartment could remain strong. This became the foundation of modern passive safety design, and Barini accumulated over 2,500 patents during his career, more than twice the number held by Thomas Edison. The same year, 1959, a Volvo engineer named Nils Ivar Bolin invented something that would become the single most important safety device in automotive history: the three-point seatbelt. Previous seatbelts were two-point lap belts that could actually cause serious injuries and crashes, but Bolin's three-point design with straps going across the lap and diagonally across the chest distributed crash forces across the stronger parts of the body. Here's what makes this story remarkable. Volvo deliberately gave the patent away for free, releasing it to all manufacturers in 1968 because they believed, as Bolin stated, that safety should be shared. German patent registrars later recognized the three-point seatbelt as one of the 8 patents with the greatest significance for humanity between 1885 and 1985, and by the time Bolin died in 2002, his invention had saved an estimated 1 million lives. Today, that number is far higher, with the three-point seatbelt saving about 11,000 lives annually in the United States alone. But automobile manufacturers weren't voluntarily adopting these safety features fast enough, and that's where consumer advocate Ralph Nader entered the picture. Nader published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965, which exposed dangerous automotive design practices, and Nader criticized the automobile industry for prioritizing style and design over consumer safety, specifically calling out manufacturers for designed-in dangers. General Motors responded by hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on Nader and discredit him, but when this became public, it backfired spectacularly. GM CEO James Roche was forced to apologize to Nader before the U.S. Senate, and the scandal, combined with Nader's meticulous documentation of safety failures, led to the passage of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act in 1966, which passed unanimously, and this legislation created the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, and mandated numerous safety features in vehicles. Over the following decades, more safety systems were developed and eventually mandated. GM became the first manufacturer to offer airbags in production vehicles in 1973, though widespread adoption wouldn't come until the 1990s. And the first production airbag patent actually dated back to 1953, invented by John Hetrick, but the technology took decades to become practical and affordable. Between 1987 and 2017, Airbags saved over 50,000 lives in the United States. Mercedes-Benz and Bosch introduced the first production anti-lock braking system, or ABS, in 1978, and this technology prevents wheels from locking during hard braking, allowing the driver to maintain steering control. By 2018, Bosch had supplied 457 million ABS systems worldwide. Then in 1995, Mercedes-Benz introduced electronic stability control, or ESP, developed with Bosch, and this system automatically detects when a vehicle is losing control and applies brakes to individual wheels to help stabilize it. ESP has saved over 22,000 lives in the European Union alone and is now mandatory in the US and EU. Each of these safety innovations followed a similar pattern. Engineers developed them, manufacturers initially resisted due to cost concerns, advocates pushed for adoption, and eventually regulations made them mandatory, and each time, after implementation, the industry's claims that the requirements were technically impossible or too expensive were proven wrong. Lives were saved, and the costs came down as production scaled up. The lesson from this era is clear. When it comes to safety, the market alone is not enough, and regulatory standards informed by engineering innovation and pushed by advocacy save lives at a scale that voluntary adoption never achieved. While safety became a priority in the 1960s and 1970s, another crisis was brewing. Air pollution and automobiles were at the center of it. The problem first became visible in Los Angeles. Los Angeles experienced what residents called a gas attack in 1943, a thick smog that stung their eyes and restricted breathing, and people initially blamed industrial plants. But in 1952, Professor Ari Hagen-Smit identified the real culprit: automobile exhaust. The chemicals from car emissions were reacting with sunlight to create photochemical smog. The automobile industry's initial response was denial and delay, claiming that reducing emissions would be technically impossible, that it would cripple vehicle performance, and that the costs would make cars unaffordable. This should sound familiar. It's the same response the industry gave to safety regulations. The turning point came with the 1970 Clean Air Act, which required a 90% reduction in vehicle emissions, and manufacturers again protested, but engineers went to work on solutions. The key innovation was the catalytic converter, which uses precious metals to convert harmful exhaust gases into less harmful substances, and the first production catalytic converters appeared in 1973. By 1975, they became mandatory on most US cars. The impact has been staggering. Catalytic converters have eliminated more than 10 billion tons of pollution from the atmosphere. 10 billion tons, and despite the industry's protests, vehicles became more efficient and reliable, not less. Today's cars produce near-zero emissions compared to vehicles from the 1960s, while delivering far better performance and fuel economy. Around the same time, fuel injection technology was advancing. While various forms of fuel injection had existed since the 1950s, Mercedes-Benz introduced the 300 SL with direct injection in 1955. It was Bosch's development of the D-Jetronic electronic fuel injection system in 1967 that made the technology practical for mass production, and in 1979, Bosch introduced Motronic, which integrated digital fuel injection with ignition control. Electronic fuel injection eventually replaced carburetors entirely because it provided better fuel economy, lower emissions, and more reliable starting. But the relationship between the automobile industry and environmental regulation remained contentious, with manufacturers repeatedly claiming that new standards were impossible to meet, yet engineers repeatedly proved them wrong. The pattern continued through decades of progressively stricter emission standards, fuel economy requirements, and safety regulations. The environmental movement also began questioning the automobile-centric development that had reshaped American cities. Critics pointed out that the interstate highway system, authorized in 1956 as the largest public works program in American history, had encouraged suburban sprawl, decimated urban neighborhoods, and created dependence on cars for every aspect of daily life. There was also controversy around the decline of public transit, and the so-called GM streetcar conspiracy remains debated by historians. Between 1936 and 1950, a company called National City Lines, with investment from GM, Firestone, Standard Oil, and others, acquired transit systems in about 45 cities, and in 1949, these companies were convicted under the Sherman Antitrust Act for conspiring to monopolize sales of buses and supplies, but they were fined $5,000 each, a trivial amount that critics said amounted to a license to destroy public transit. Historians debate whether this caused streetcar decline or merely accelerated trends that were already happening due to changing consumer preferences and the appeal of personal automobiles. What's undeniable is that by 1970, American society had fully committed to automobile transportation. There were 118 million cars on U.S. roads, 4 times the 1950 figure, and 1/3 of Americans lived in suburbs. 11 of the 12 largest U.S. cities experienced population decline in the 1950s, with only car-centric Los Angeles gaining population. And today, 92% of American households own at least one vehicle. Remember how we mentioned that in 1900, electric vehicles had a 38% market share in America? What happened to them, and why did they essentially disappear for nearly a century before coming back? Electric vehicles faced several fundamental challenges in the early 20th century. Battery technology was heavy, expensive, and limited in range, typically under 100 miles, and gasoline vehicles could refuel in minutes at a growing network of gas stations, while electric vehicles required hours to recharge. Gasoline engines also benefited from continuous improvement, becoming more reliable, more powerful, and easier to start, and the electric starter motor introduced in 1912 eliminated the need for hand-cranking gasoline engines, removing one of the last advantages electric vehicles had. As roads improved and Americans wanted to travel longer distances, the range limitation became fatal for electric vehicles, and by the 1920s, gasoline engines had essentially won the technological competition. Electric vehicles became a curiosity, occasionally used for limited applications like delivery trucks in cities, but they disappeared from the personal vehicle market almost entirely. This remained the status quo for decades. Occasionally, in response to oil crises or environmental concerns, manufacturers would create concept electric vehicles, but none reached significant production, and the batteries, typically lead acid, were still too heavy and limited in range to be practical. Then, in the 1990s, something unexpected happened. California introduced a zero-emission vehicle mandate, requiring that a certain percentage of vehicles sold in the state produce no emissions, and this forced manufacturers to actually develop electric vehicles. GM created the EV1, which was leased to customers starting in 1996, and the EV1 used advanced lead-acid batteries initially, later upgraded to nickel-metal hydride, with a range of about 70 to 100 miles. It was quick too, 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 8 seconds. The EV1 attracted a devoted following, but GM made a controversial decision. Despite protests from lessees who wanted to purchase the vehicles, GM recalled every EV1 when the leases ended and had them crushed. Most were literally destroyed, and GM's explanation was that the vehicles weren't economically viable and that there wasn't sufficient demand. Many EV1 drivers passionately disagreed, though. They loved their vehicles and wanted to keep them. The EV1's destruction became symbolic, with critics seeing it as proof that oil companies and automakers were actively suppressing electric vehicle technology. A documentary called Who Killed the Electric Car explored this controversy, and Rick Wagoner, GM's CEO at the time, later admitted that killing the EV1 was his worst decision. But while GM was crushing the EV1, something else was happening that would change everything. Lithium-ion battery technology was advancing. Lithium-ion batteries were lighter, more energy-dense, and longer-lasting than any previous battery technology, and they were being developed for laptops and mobile phones. But some visionaries saw their potential for vehicles. On July 1, 2003, two engineers named Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning incorporated a company called Tesla Motors, and both were motivated partly by GM's decision to crush the EV1. They wanted to prove that electric vehicles could be desirable, high-performance products. Elon Musk, an entrepreneur, invested $6.5 million in Tesla in February 2004 and became chairman of the board, and later, J.B. Straubel and Ian Wright joined the company. There's controversy about who founded Tesla. Eberhard was the original CEO until 2007, but Musk later began calling himself a founder, and in June 2009, Eberhard sued Musk for setting out to rewrite history. They settled in September 2009 with an agreement that all five, Eberhard, Tarpenning, Musk, Straubel, and Wright, would be legally recognized as co-founders, and Musk called Eberhard literally the worst person I've ever worked with in 2019, so there's clearly lasting bitterness. Regardless of the founding controversy, Tesla's first vehicle, the Roadster, which began production in 2008, proved that electric vehicles could be exciting. Using lithium-ion batteries, it had a range of over 200 miles and could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 4 seconds, making it the first highway-legal EV using lithium-ion batteries. It was also expensive, over $100,000, but it proved the technology worked. Tesla became the first American automaker to go public since Ford in 1956 in June 2010, and Tesla pioneered several business model innovations: direct sales to consumers rather than using dealerships, over-the-air software updates that could add features and improve performance after purchase, and a proprietary network of fast-charging stations called superchargers. But Tesla wasn't alone in the electric vehicle renaissance. Nissan began delivering the Leaf in December 2010, the first mass-market electric vehicle from a major manufacturer, and it initially had a 73-mile range and was far more affordable than the Tesla Roadster, with a starting price around $30,000. Then in December 1997, actually before Tesla existed, Toyota had launched the Prius in Japan, and the Prius was the world's first mass-produced hybrid vehicle, combining a gasoline engine with an electric motor and battery. This wasn't purely electric, but it proved that electrification could work in practical, affordable vehicles, and the Prius became a cultural icon, particularly popular in environmentally conscious markets like California. The key to all of this was batteries. The cost of lithium-ion battery packs has fallen about 90% from 2010 to 2024, going from between $1,100 and $1,436 per kilowatt-hour in 2010 down to around $400 by 2015, then around $140 by 2020, and in 2024, they've reached about $115 per kilowatt-hour, with projections suggesting they'll hit around $80 by 2026. This price collapse has made electric vehicles economically competitive with gasoline vehicles, especially when you consider lower operating costs. Electricity is cheaper than gasoline, and electric vehicles have fewer moving parts that require maintenance. While American and European manufacturers dominated the 20th century, the 21st century has seen Asian manufacturers, particularly Chinese companies, reshape the global automotive landscape. We already mentioned Toyota, which has become the world's largest automaker, but China has emerged as the dominant force in electric vehicle production. In the automobile division space, the most significant Chinese player is BYD, whose auto division was founded in January 2003, and the company was originally a battery manufacturer, founded in 1995 by Wang Chuanfu. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway invested in BYD in 2008, recognizing the company's potential. BYD made a dramatic decision in 2022. They stopped producing internal combustion engine vehicles entirely, becoming an EV-only manufacturer, and in 2024, BYD sold 3.82 million vehicles, an increase of 41.8%, making them the world's largest EV manufacturer. BYD actually surpassed Tesla in quarterly battery electric vehicle sales in Q4 of 2023. The Chinese EV market is massive and growing. China sold about 11.3 million electric vehicles in 2024, representing about 45% of all new car sales in China. And to put that in perspective, China produced over 31.2 million vehicles in 2024, about one-third of global production. Besides BYD, other Chinese manufacturers like Li Auto and NIO are positioning themselves for future growth, and the combination of government support, massive domestic market, and vertical integration in battery production has given Chinese manufacturers significant advantages in the EV transition. Meanwhile, traditional manufacturers worldwide are scrambling to transition to electric vehicles, with every major automaker announcing plans to electrify their lineup, with various targets for phasing out internal combustion engines. Some, like Volvo, have announced they'll be EV only by 2030, while others are hedging their bets with hybrid technology. But this transition isn't smooth. Many traditional manufacturers, particularly American and European companies, are struggling with the shift because they've spent decades optimizing internal combustion engine production and have extensive investments in that technology. Transitioning to EVs requires retooling factories, developing new supply chains, and competing with companies like Tesla and BYD that were designed from the ground up for electric vehicles. The global production numbers tell the story. Total global vehicle production was about 92.5 million vehicles in 2024, and China produced over 31 million of those. The US produced about 10.5 million, down 1% year over year. Germany produced about 4 million, also down 1%. India produced 5.2 million, up 4.7%, and Japan's production declined 8.6%. The geographic center of automobile manufacturing has shifted. Detroit is no longer the undisputed automotive capital of the world. That title arguably belongs to regions of China now. The automotive industry's history includes not just innovation, but also spectacular failures, deception, and cover-ups that cost lives and destroyed reputations. The largest automotive scandal in history is Volkswagen's Dieselgate. The EPA discovered in September 2015 that Volkswagen had installed defeat devices in their diesel vehicles, software that could detect when the car was being tested for emissions and would activate emissions controls only during those tests. And in normal driving, the vehicles emitted up to 40 times more nitrogen oxides than legally allowed. The scale of the deception was staggering. 11 million vehicles were affected worldwide, and the financial consequences were equally massive, with over $33.3 billion in settlements, fines, and recalls. CEO Martin Winterkorn resigned, and engineer Oliver Schmidt was sentenced to 7 years in prison, while the health impact was severe. A European report estimated that 72,000 EU residents die prematurely each year from nitrogen oxide emissions. What makes Dieselgate particularly damning is that Volkswagen marketed these vehicles as clean diesel, appealing to environmentally conscious consumers while deliberately deceiving them, and the scandal destroyed consumer trust in diesel technology and accelerated the shift toward electric vehicles. Another scandal with deadly consequences was GM's ignition switch recall. GM had known since 2004 or 2005 about defective ignition switches that could turn off the engine while driving, disabling airbags, but they didn't issue recalls until February 2014, eventually expanding to 30 million vehicles worldwide. The fix would have cost 90 cents per vehicle, and that 90-cent part was responsible for at least 124 confirmed deaths and 274 injuries, with total cost to GM exceeding $2 billion. Remarkably, no individual executives were criminally charged. Tesla has faced its own controversies around autopilot safety. NHTSA issued findings in April 2024, identifying a critical safety gap between driver expectations and autopilot capabilities, and the investigation linked 467 crashes to autopilot, with 65 fatalities associated with autopilot or full self-driving features. Tesla was called an industry outlier in its approach to Level 2 technology, with system design that led to foreseeable misuse and avoidable crashes. The first fatal autopilot crash occurred on May 7, 2016, when Joshua Brown was killed in Williston, Florida, after his Model S drove under an 18-wheel tractor-trailer at 74 miles per hour. The autopilot system failed to detect the white trailer against a bright sky, and in August 2024, a jury awarded $243 million in damages against Tesla in a case where autopilot was found to have contributed to a fatal crash. These scandals share common themes: corporations prioritizing profit over safety, internal knowledge of problems being suppressed, and delayed responses that cost lives. And they also demonstrate that regulatory oversight and legal accountability, while imperfect, serve essential functions in protecting consumers. The newest frontier in automotive technology is removing the driver entirely. Autonomous vehicles promise to reduce accidents, ease traffic congestion, and provide mobility to those who can't drive. But the technology has proven far more difficult than early optimists predicted, and recent setbacks have tempered expectations. Several companies are pursuing autonomous vehicles, but they're taking different approaches. Waymo, owned by Google's parent company Alphabet, is pursuing what's called Level 4 autonomy, vehicles that can drive themselves in specific conditions without human intervention. And as of December 2025, Waymo is providing over 450,000 paid rides weekly in 5 U.S. cities: Phoenix, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Austin. Waymo vehicles have achieved a disengagement rate of 9,793 miles per disengagement in 2024, meaning the vehicles can drive almost 10,000 miles before requiring human intervention. But not everyone has been successful. GM's Cruise division suffered a major setback in October 2023 when a Cruise robot taxi dragged a pedestrian 20 feet in San Francisco, and the CEO resigned. 24% of the workforce was laid off, and Cruise was fined $500,000 by the Department of Justice. GM announced in December 2024 that it would stop funding Cruise robot taxis entirely. Tesla's approach is different and more controversial. Unlike Waymo, which uses expensive LiDAR sensors and operates only in carefully mapped areas, Tesla is attempting to achieve autonomous driving using only cameras and neural networks. And Tesla's full self-driving feature remains Level 2 technology, meaning it requires constant driver supervision. The driver is legally responsible and must be ready to take over at any moment. Tesla's autopilot marketing has been criticized for creating dangerous misunderstandings about the system's capabilities, with the names autopilot and full self-driving suggesting more capability than the system actually has. Despite years of development and testing on hundreds of thousands of vehicles, FSD Beta has been deployed to over 400,000 users. Tesla has not achieved Level 4 or Level 5 autonomy, and in June 2025, Tesla began a robotaxi pilot in Austin, but even these vehicles still use safety drivers. The fundamental challenge of autonomous driving is that it requires near-perfect reliability. About 40,000 people die in vehicle crashes annually in the United States alone, and humans are imperfect drivers, but humans accept other humans making mistakes in ways they don't accept machines making mistakes. An autonomous system that's twice as safe as a human driver might still face public rejection if it causes even a few high-profile deaths. There's also the question of edge cases, unusual situations that occur rarely but require good judgment, and humans handle these imperfectly but flexibly, while teaching AI systems to handle every possible edge case has proven extraordinarily difficult. The regulatory environment is still evolving, with different states having different rules for testing autonomous vehicles, and there's no clear federal framework yet for when and how fully autonomous vehicles should be allowed to operate. Insurance liability questions remain unresolved. If an autonomous vehicle causes a crash, who's liable? The manufacturer? The software developer? The vehicle owner? Despite these challenges, progress continues. Waymo's success in multiple cities demonstrates that Level 4 autonomy is achievable in controlled environments, and the technology will likely roll out gradually, starting with specific routes or areas, rather than as an immediate replacement for human drivers everywhere. The past 5 years have seen electric vehicles cross from niche product to mainstream transportation, and the statistics tell a clear story of accelerating adoption. Global EV sales have grown dramatically, about 3.5 million in 2020, 6.5 million in 2021, 10 million in 2022, 14 million in 2023, and 17.1 million in 2024, representing 21% of all new vehicles sold globally, more than 1 in 5 new cars. Regional adoption varies significantly. Norway leads the world with an astonishing 88.89% of new vehicle sales being electric. China is at about 45%. Europe averages around 20%, and the United States lags at about 10 to 11%. Tesla's Model Y became the best-selling car globally in 2023, not just the best-selling EV, but the best-selling vehicle of any kind, with 1.22 million units sold, marking the first time a battery electric vehicle topped global sales charts. It's a symbolic moment, like when the Ford Model T overtook horse-drawn carriages. Over 110 new EV models have entered the US market since 2020, giving consumers far more choices than ever before. And range anxiety, the fear of running out of charge, is becoming less of an issue as ranges increase and charging infrastructure expands. Many new EVs offer 300-plus miles of range, and some exceed 400 miles. Charging infrastructure has expanded dramatically, with Tesla's supercharger network being an early advantage. But other charging networks have grown significantly, and Tesla has also begun opening its supercharger network to other manufacturers' vehicles in some market, improving overall charging availability. But the transition isn't without challenges and resistance. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered a global semiconductor chip shortage that revealed automotive supply chain vulnerabilities, with auto OEMs canceling chip orders at the pandemic's onset, and foundries reallocated that capacity to consumer electronics. When auto demand recovered faster than expected, there weren't enough chips available. The shortage was severe. Global auto production slumped 26% during the first 9 months of 2021. About 12.5 million vehicles couldn't be produced in 2021 and 2022. The industry lost an estimated $110 billion in annual production, and median semiconductor inventories dropped from 40 days in 2019 to less than 5 days in 2021. The CHIPS and Science Act, passed in August 2022, allocated about $53 billion to boost U.S. semiconductor manufacturing, and by mid-2023, the shortage had largely resolved. There have also been policy shifts. The European Union originally planned a complete ban on internal combustion engine vehicle sales by 2035, but they scrapped that plan in favor of targeting a 90% CO2 reduction instead, which allows e-fuels, biofuels, and hybrids to continue. Germany, Italy, and other nations lobbied for this relaxation, arguing that an absolute ban was too inflexible. Battery technology continues advancing rapidly. Toyota is targeting commercialization of solid-state batteries in 2027 to 2028, developed with partner Idemitsu Kosan, and they claim these batteries will offer a 20% cruising range improvement, 10-minute charging from 10 to 80% state of charge, and batteries designed to last 40 years while retaining 90% capacity. If achieved, this could enable vehicles with 621-mile range, over 1,000 kilometers, and Mercedes-Benz also successfully integrated solid-state batteries into a production vehicle platform in February 2025 with Factorial Energy. Throughout automotive history, the relationship between manufacturers and workers has been contentious, and we talked earlier about Ford's $5 workday, a rare example of a company voluntarily improving worker compensation, but more often, improvements came through labor organizing and strikes. The United Auto Workers Union, or UAW, was founded in 1935 and grew powerful through the mid-20th century, securing good wages and benefits for American auto workers. But as manufacturing globalized and companies faced increased competition, the relationship became more adversarial. The UAW launched what they called a stand-up strike in September and October 2023, the first ever simultaneous strike against all three major American automakers, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, which owns Chrysler. And UAW President Shawn Fain led an aggressive campaign, and the results were historic. The UAW won a 25% wage increase over 4.5 years, cost of living adjustments were restored, the two-tier wage system where newer workers made significantly less than senior workers was eliminated, and workers gained the first ever right to strike over plant closures. President Biden joined the picket line, making him the first sitting president to do so in decades. UAW President Shawn Fain summarized it powerfully. Our union just showed the world what's possible when workers unite and fight for more. This strike matters because the transition to electric vehicles has implications for workers. EVs have fewer parts than internal combustion vehicles, no transmission, no exhaust system, simpler engine design, and manufacturers claim they'll need fewer workers to build them. Some estimates suggest EV production requires 30 to 40% less labor than ICE vehicle production. Workers understandably worry that the EV transition will eliminate their jobs, and the UAW's success in 2023 demonstrated that workers still have significant leverage and that corporations making record profits can afford to share more with the people building the products. The broader issue is that automotive manufacturing was the pathway to the middle class for millions of American families in the 20th century, with factory workers with high school educations earning solid wages, buying homes, and supporting families. As manufacturing declines or becomes more automated, what replaces those opportunities? This remains an unresolved economic and social challenge. We need to step back from technology and business to understand what the automobile actually did to human society, because the car didn't just change transportation, it changed everything. Before automobiles, cities were compact, with people living near where they worked because they traveled on foot, by streetcar, or by carriage, and the maximum practical distance from home to work was measured in how far you could comfortably walk or how far a streetcar could take you. The automobile shattered that limitation. Suddenly you could live 10, 20, 30 miles from your workplace, and this enabled the massive suburban expansion that reshaped America. Levittown, Pennsylvania, which opened in 1951, pioneered planned suburbanization, mass-produced houses designed for automobile access, and by the end of the 1950s, 1/3 of Americans lived in suburbs. Today, 92% of American households own at least one vehicle. The numbers show how dramatic this shift was. 11 of the 12 largest U.S. cities experienced population decline in the 1950s, and only Los Angeles, a city essentially designed around the automobile from the start, gained population. People weren't disappearing, though. They were moving to suburbs. The Interstate Highway System, authorized in 1956, was the largest public works program in American history, and by 1970, there were 118 million cars on U.S. roads, 4 times the 1950 count, and America had literally reconstructed itself around the automobile. This had profound social effects. The car changed courtship and dating, because before automobiles, young people courted under parental supervision, but cars introduced mobility and privacy into relationships. Parents worried about what teenagers were doing in cars, and they were right to worry, because cars changed teenage culture entirely. Drive-in theaters first appeared in 1933, peaked at over 4,000 theaters in the 1950s, and became known colloquially as passion pits, popular partly because teenagers could watch movies without adult supervision. Cars became symbols of identity and freedom, with the Ford Mustang, introduced in 1964, and the Chevrolet Corvette becoming icons of American automotive culture. Hot rod and custom car culture blossomed, and the Bonneville Salt Flats became known as the holy grail of American hot rodding. Music and car culture merged. Rocket 88, recorded in 1951 and often called the first rock and roll song, celebrated the Oldsmobile 88, and Chuck Berry and the Beach Boys made cars central to their music. By the early 1960s, car radios were standard equipment. The car also became central to American notions of individualism. Unlike public transit, where you share space with strangers and follow fixed routes and schedules, the car gave you personal freedom, privacy, and control, letting you go where you wanted, when you wanted, with whom you wanted. What scholars call the American symbol of individuality and freedom isn't just marketing, it reflects genuine cultural values. But this automobile-centric development had costs. Cities were carved up by freeways that destroyed neighborhoods, often minority neighborhoods, as highway planners routed freeways through areas with less political power and public transit systems were neglected or actively dismantled. People who couldn't afford cars or couldn't drive found themselves increasingly isolated. The environmental costs were also significant. Suburban sprawl consumed farmland and natural areas. Air pollution from automobiles caused health problems and contributed to climate change, though climate concerns didn't become mainstream until recent decades, and car dependency made Americans more sedentary, contributing to obesity and related health problems. The car gave us incredible mobility and freedom, but it also locked us into patterns of development that are difficult to change because we built our cities, suburbs, and infrastructure around the assumption that everyone would drive everywhere. Now, as we recognize problems with that model, we're finding that changing course is enormously expensive and difficult. As we reach the present day in 2026, the automobile industry stands at a crossroads comparable to the shift from horses to cars in the early 1900s, with multiple simultaneous transitions happening from internal combustion to electric power, from human drivers to autonomous systems, and from vehicle ownership to shared mobility services. Electric vehicle adoption continues accelerating, and most projections suggest EVs will reach cost parity with gasoline vehicles without subsidies within the next few years as battery costs continue falling. Once EVs are cheaper to buy and cheaper to operate, the transition will accelerate further, but challenges remain. Charging infrastructure needs to expand significantly, especially for people who live in apartments or don't have home charging. The electrical grid needs upgrades to handle millions of vehicles charging, and battery material supply chains need to scale up dramatically. There are concerns about securing enough lithium, cobalt, and other materials. There's also the question of what happens to the existing fleet of internal combustion vehicles, because in the US alone, there are over 280 million registered vehicles, and even if all new vehicle sales switch to EVs tomorrow, it would take decades for the entire fleet to turn over. Used gasoline vehicles will remain on roads for many years. Solid-state batteries, if they deliver on their promises in 2027 or 2028, could be a game-changer, offering longer range, faster charging, and longer lifespan than current lithium-ion technology, and this could eliminate the remaining practical disadvantages EVs have compared to gasoline vehicles. Autonomous vehicles face a longer, more uncertain path. Despite billions invested in development, true Level 5 autonomy vehicles that can drive anywhere in any conditions without human oversight remains elusive, and Waymo's success demonstrates that Level 4 autonomy works in limited areas. But expanding to all roads and all conditions is proving extremely difficult. The broader questions about transportation are about more than technology. Do we want a future where everyone owns a car, or will shared autonomous vehicles reduce the need for ownership? Will we continue suburban sprawl patterns, or will we rebuild more compact, walkable cities with better public transit? How do we ensure that transportation benefits everyone, not just those who can afford the latest technology? There's also the matter of who builds the cars. Chinese manufacturers, particularly in EVs, have advantages in scale, battery supply chains, and government support, while traditional American and European manufacturers face tough competition. Tesla disrupted the industry by approaching cars as software-defined products with frequent updates, but now every manufacturer is trying to copy that approach.